Hello, welcome to another episode on Talk Architecture podcast with your host, Naziaty Mohd Yaacob. I had been involved with disability activism since the year 1998, and I'll be retiring for good very soon. However, I like to reflect on what had happened in those years that I took up disability activism. Just because I'm a disabled person from the age of 3, as a physically disabled person, I have gone through challenges on everyday things to do with going to school, traveling, and going to university, and just basically those challenges were not very difficult or were not insurmountable. They were able to be done. And I did not really miss out on a lot of things. But what it was that I took architecture. I was trained to be an architect, and then I went into academia. So when I was in academia, just a year into it, in one of the universities in Kuala Lumpur, I did a training with the United Nations Economic Social Commission Asia Pacific. They came to town. They came to Malaysia, and I was involved with cross disability training, and I was introduced to a training of trainers program for non-handicapping environment. It coincided with the decade of disabled person the year before worldwide, and then in the Asia Pacific started with the decade of disabled persons in the Asian Pacific region. Subsequently, in 1999, we hosted the conference for Campaign 99 in Malaysia, and then in the year 2000, we assisted with the one in Bangkok. Now, I learned a lot from disability activism or social activism, where we also learned about social mobilization. There was a training about a week in Pattaya, and we were exposed to a lot of ideas. We visited case studies of people who are disabled and poor. In Malaysia, I did not have this opportunity to study case studies of people who are disabled and poor. So it was in Bangkok, it was in Thailand where I actually studied. And later, in conjunction with the non-handicapping environment course for trainers, it gave a lot of insight to disability. The concepts and terminologies and the interactions I had, the training, the exposure in terms of international activists and resource persons made me aware of a lot of things, and it helped me think about what is necessary to do with disability activism in Malaysia, but more so how it impacted on the architectural training that I'm giving to students of architecture. I recalled in very early on, perhaps in 1999 itself, with the third year students, we just had some wheelchairs and students doing another project, but they were just having a chance to actually understand about all the barriers that disabled persons encounter with regard to the built environment. I recalled going onto the pavement, having to have no way to go cross the road because there is no curb cuts or step ramps to go from one curb or pavement to another. So they also did access surveys of buildings, and later I understood more about the issues at hand, and I was acquainted to guidelines and standards, and I did offer an elective for architecture students and also those in the built environment faculty, like quantity surveyors and planners and others, building surveyors, to do the course as well. It was a degree elective course. And there was one occasion we actually did a seminar or some sort of a workshop combined for the university. And similar things were done with local authorities when I had the chance to design a day's course. And later, I went to do my doctoral studies in the UK, which I had to reconcile the topic of accessibility with heritage buildings, because I love to study about old buildings. And I was a conservation activist, building conservation activist, before I was a disability activist for a few years, but my interest in historic buildings and heritage was kind of very deep and strong. Influence of a certain Professor James Stevens Curl back then in Leicester Polytechnic in the 80s. Anyway, fast forward again. So I suppose activism was part and parcel of who I am. But I think when I reflect back, it's less so to do with my character or less so to do with the sort of courage that I need to muster with regard to activism. It is to do with the interdisciplinary of disability and architecture, in which is a lifetime calling and the life purpose that I found in the work that I do. Now, it's not one or another or the other, it's both together. The intersectionalities, shall we say, between disability and architecture helped me to actually design those courses. The most successful one was the recent ones, and it was validated by people who I invited to come for the seminar where the student presented at the end of the semester, when they did an access auditing part and also later the design part of the problem that they identified an area of the building which they had highlighted in the access audit report earlier. So they did a design or some sort of renovation, some sort of solution to the problem before, and it helped a lot to actually understand the functionality aspects of building, and they go deeply into the measurement of anthropometrics and the performance of the space and the details, including the furniture and other equipment. So design can only resolve some of the problem. Design, if done at the beginning, rather than renovated it somewhere later after it was built, would be better, of course, because you can actually incorporate universal design as part of the design concept. But of course, when it comes to actually access auditing an existing building and finding out, identifying the problems and actually giving solutions, the students also learn about what are standards, and also they have to think beyond designing with standards. As an architect, you would want to innovate, you'd want to think about more than standards, but the students actually kind of complied with the standards. When we would need an accreditation system for universal design for building excellence in our country, there are some examples in Singapore that I know which had been successful in promoting and getting architects to love universal design and be part of their concept. And in Singapore, they have this policy of looking into the aging population and designing for the aging population in terms of the planning aspects of the country, and a lot of funding has gone into that, into the street environment, the transportation system, and into public housing. So in Malaysia, that sort of universal design accreditation system, similar to the Green Building Index or other similar accreditation system that we have in the country, would provide some idea of standardization. It would be great if there's only one sort of system, but this will lead into a much more conscientious or a better consciousness of what is happening to the aging population, and in terms of the designer's mantra or the designer's philosophy in approaching design. Big companies and developers would be the focus here, where they could take up on universal design accreditation system and try to compete for to be of the highest award, like a platinum, gold, silver, and bronze sort of system. That could be one of the ways in which we could go about it. But being able to travel around the region, we see examples in Hong Kong, we see examples in Singapore, where the architects embrace this. Many are proud. The ones that we met when we visited those buildings, they were happy to say how they resolve things even beyond standards. And that's kind of like what we aspire to, or what we want the country to have with the professionals in architecture be doing. And with this consciousness and the need to actually get it right, then much of the activism could be lessened, and we can concentrate on different aspects of activism in the country. So I'd like to concentrate on architecture and disability in my work as a consultant. And this is necessary for the country because what we have is the lack of such people knowledgeable in this aspect of interdisciplinary or intersections of disability and architecture. Of course, when we talk about intersections, it's usually referring to the human condition, or, gender or race and disability and so on. But when I talk about architecture, then I'll talk about architects, obviously, those trained in architecture, and those who are the vanguards, or those who are responsible for the built environment. And this particular piece of podcast episode is a personal piece which sort of summarizes the values that a society needs to give to. In terms of education of the architect, a continuing professional development in a way, and also, if possible, to be made compulsory with the professional degree courses. The chicken and egg situation, the education people higher education people look at the industry is looking at them back and looking at government, and they're all looking at each other. Who are the bigger players in this? There are some effort needing in terms of partnering some sectors of the society in terms of businesses. And we can see in Malaysia the developers and those involved in real estate are kind of like a lot of decision or a lot of, shall we say, influence come from this sector, come from this group of people. I do find that my ex-students, when they work with architecture companies right after they finish their degree or the the Masters of Architecture, and then they would go to work in an architecture company, and I have talked about the entrepreneurial architectural graduate, and then the traditional architecture graduate, and the ones that have yet to make up their mind. They passed, they got part 2, but they have yet to make up their mind about architecture. Some of them become project managers. So we see that from this evidence of what they say, how they are interested or not in architecture, we see that they could go into specialization. I've dealt with this topic earlier in architect entrepreneur, hypothesis and design thesis episode recently. So what we can see from here is that some of these graduates, they go to work with developers, obviously because they would pay better, and it feels like a bit more stabilizing in certain parts, certain time of their life. And some of them do work for a long time with developers, and some of them opt out after that to, shall we say, strike out on their own. Now, things are changing, nothing stays the same. So things are evolving and changing. How do we deal with these things that are changing? But we need to actually be mindful of universal design and accessibility, because it costs more not to think about it in the beginning stages of design. And how can we make it more seamless in the, shall we say, the toolbox or the skill set of an architect? Understanding disability would ensure that the designer would be much more sensitive, much more able to grasp the concepts of accessibility and the principles of universal design. So to ensure that in the beginning, it's more about the chicken and egg again. How do you actually want to understand? Because you're going to spend a day, and because your client says you got to try to make that building accessible, that building get the platinum award. I'd want to that is my branding, because I'm a developer who wants to be doing multi-generational housing, for example. Yes, that chicken and egg will eventually make that group of professionals be much more conscious, be much more aware, and do it in the everyday practices. So that's all I actually want to talk about for 20 minutes, and I'm grateful that you're listening to that. And there'll be more of such episodes on the intersections or the interdisciplinary, combining both disability and architecture, or the architect. Well, thank you very much for listening, and talk to you again. Bye.